Professor Marlou Schrover just gave a presentation during the Lampedusa Dilemma conference, which is the launching event of the new EUI Forum on Migration, Citizenship and Demography. Professor Schrover, you have spoken about how gender can contribute, a perspective on gender can contribute to our understanding of migration in the past history of Europe, but also for these contemporary times. Could you please summarize for us your main view?
What I did is I made a comparison over time and between migrant men and migrant women. So I made this double comparison. And so if you look at the difference between men and women in migration, there are differences. There's no denying in that there aren't differences between men and women to begin with. There are also differences over time. I mean, the migration of today is not the same as the migration in the past. But what I wanted to point out in my presentation is the continuities. So although I acknowledge that there are differences, I emphasize the continuities over time. And so if you then look at the continuities over time, what you see is that the women are portrayed very often as victims. So there's a very strong victimhood discourse when it comes to the migration of women, much more than when it comes to the migration of men. So men are portrayed as a risk and women are portrayed as at risk. So it's just one letter, but it makes a big difference. And as a result, you see that the policies regarding the migration of men differ from those regarding the migration of women. So for men, there is restrictionism. For women, there's protectionism. And over time, this works out, in my view, and that's what I try to bring out in the presentation, to the disadvantage of women. So what you see over time is that the protectionist measures, which are put in place to protect women, also enforce the image that these are women at risk, these are victims, and the very strong victimhood discourse which comes with that sort of disadvantages women in the long run. So from a policy perspective, if you come to, what do we do with these views regarding the Lampedusa Dilemma, you see that many of the policies today in place are spectacular. It's the spectacle of border protection which is important. Which doesn't do much to keep migrants out, in effect, but also sort of denies what is the difference between migration of men and women. And when it comes to women, it very much works to their disadvantage in the first place, but it's also used to justify restrictionist policies. So protecting women is a very strong argument for restrictionist policies. Politicians will not say, look, we're going to restrict migration. They will rather say, look, we're going to protect migrant women. It makes a much stronger political claim than just restrictionism.
I was wondering if you could provide an example of what are the lacks in the academic debate that need to be filled by future debates.
Well, if you look at the literature on women on migration or gender and migration, both, you see that some subjects get addressed a lot. So that's domestic workers, prostitution, and trafficking. Trafficking is by far the issue that's addressed most in the literature, and the concept of trafficking is stretched endlessly. And here you see a large continuity over time. The number of publications on trafficking or white slavery, as it was called in the beginning of the 20th century, is enormous. And also the number of policies developed in order to fight trafficking is spectacular. I mean, there's conferences, there's treaties, there's newspaper articles, movies in the beginning of the 20th century already. What we as academia, what we have to sort of fight, nuance, fill the gaps to fill, is that suddenly all women are portrayed as either ending up as domestic servants when they migrate, or as prostitutes, or as being trafficked. But what you see is very often that what's labeled trafficking when it comes to women is called smuggling when it comes to men. So if you have assisted migration when you're a woman, very often people say, look, this is trafficking. If as a man you pay for the services of some smuggler, they will say it's smuggling. So the very same thing that happens, men and women doing almost the same thing, suddenly is framed very different when it comes to men or when it comes to women. What that does is, what we as academics then should do is try to say, okay, who's doing what and for what reason? So rather than saying, look, we shouldn't study these issues, I think we should. I mean, there's still a lot to be done in this respect, and there's no reason to say, look, let's stop doing it, stop addressing these issues, but rather than looking at, trying to grasp, like politicians do, how many women are trafficked, for instance, like that, because that's a question that can't be answered because the concept is stretched endlessly, so it's a very difficult question to answer. What we can do is study who is doing this labeling and why. What's the functionality of this endless repetition of some points of view? I mean, why are they being used, who's using them, and how are they reinterpreted over time? So these changes over time, for me as an historian, are the challenge, to see when things get relabeled and who is using which arguments to claim what precisely, what's the problem and what's the solution. So I think that's the interesting thing for us as academics to do.